October 7th, 1943. The Blackett Strait is a suffocating void of humid heat and ink-black water. There is no moon. The only sound is the low, muffled burble of 3 Packard engines idling in neutral, their exhausts buried underwater to hide the noise. On the plywood deck of a patrol torpedo boat, a young gunner wipes sweat from his eyes, his hands gripping the spade handles of a weapon that does not belong here. It isn't a naval gun. It is an aircraft cannon, a 37mm heavy autocannon, scavenged from a wrecked P-39 fighter plane and bolted to the bow with scrap metal and hope. Suddenly, a shadow detaches itself from the shoreline. A Japanese Daihatsu barge, sitting low and heavy with ammunition, drifts into the crosshairs. The gunner squeezes the trigger. The silence shatters, not with the rapid rattle of machine guns, but with a slow, rhythmic, terrifying thumping. Thump, thump, thump. Explosive shells tear through the silence and the wood of the enemy vessel, detonating the cargo in a blinding tower of orange fire. In the South Pacific, the devil boats have found their new teeth. By the early months of 1943, the Solomon Islands campaign had devolved into a brutal, grinding war of attrition that defied the pre-war doctrines of both the United States and Imperial Japan. The initial shock of Guadalcanal had faded, replaced by a deadly stalemate stretching across hundreds of miles of treacherous waters known as the Slot. This narrow channel of water running through the center of the Solomon chain was the artery of death for both sides, a graveyard of iron where battleships, cruisers, and destroyers lay scattered on the seabed. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the strategic equation had become desperate. In the early phases of the campaign, they had relied on the Tokyo Express, fast, deadly runs by destroyers under the cover of darkness to deliver troops and supplies to their starving island garrisons. But destroyers were precious capital ships, intricate machines of war that took years to build, and the United States Navy and Army Air Forces were sinking them faster than Japanese shipyards could lay their keels. After the disastrous losses at the naval battle of Guadalcanal and the subsequent skirmishes, the Japanese High Command made a calculated tactical shift. They could no longer afford to risk destroyers for mere supply runs. Instead, they dissolved the Tokyo Express and replaced it with something far more difficult to detect and destroy, the Ariuso, or ant transport. This new logistics network relied not on steel-hulled warships, but on hundreds of motorized barges, specifically the Daihatsu-class landing craft. These were rugged, 50-foot wooden or steel vessels, powered by diesel engines and capable of carrying tons of cargo or nearly 100 men. Crucially, they had a draft of only a few feet. They could skim over coral reefs, hide deep inside mangrove swamps during the day, and hug the jagged coastlines at night, rendering them invisible to the primitive radar sets of the era. For the Americans, this shift was a tactical nightmare. The United States Navy had deployed its patrol torpedo boats to the Solomons with a specific doctrine in mind, to act as mosquitoes that would swarm enemy capital ships, launching heavy Mark 8 torpedoes to cripple cruisers and battleships. The PT boat was designed as a giant killer, a fragile mahogany hull packed with thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, built to deliver a knockout punch and flee. But by 1943, the giants had vanished. The PT crews patrolling the black waters of the Kula Gulf and Blackett Strait found themselves hunting ghosts. When they did spot the enemy, it was the low silhouette of a Japanese barge, hugging the shore. Here, The American technological advantage turned into a liability. The Mark 8 torpedo, the PT boat's primary weapon, was designed to run at a depth of 10 to 15 feet to strike below a warship's armor belt. When fired at a Japanese barge drawing only 3 feet of water, the torpedo would simply pass harmlessly underneath the target, running out to sea or detonating uselessly against a coral reef miles away. The American crews were frustrated. They were patrolling every night, burning out their engines and their nerves, only to watch the enemy supply lines continue unbroken. They would spot the barges, but without effective weaponry to sink them, they were impotent. The PT boat's secondary armament, usually 2 twin .50 caliber machine guns, could suppress the crew of a barge, but rarely sink it. The Japanese barges were often armored or sandbagged, and their diesel engines were robust. A few dozen machine gun rounds were not enough to stop the ants. The strategic consequence was severe. Japanese garrisons on Kolombangara, Vela La Vela, and Bougainville were continuing to receive ammunition and rice. The war was being prolonged by wooden boats that the U.S. Navy couldn't touch. The commanders in the South Pacific realized that the doctrine of the torpedo boat was dead. They didn't need giant killers anymore. They needed brawlers. They needed a weapon that could smash wood and steel at point-blank range. Something with explosive power that didn't rely on depth settings or complex guidance. The solution would not come from the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, D.C. It would come from the scrap heaps of the airfield at Henderson Field, where grounded fighter planes sat rotting in the jungle heat. To understand the birth of the Barge Busters, one must first understand the reality of life in the Mosquito Fleet. The crews of the PT squadron stationed in the Solomons lived a feral existence, far removed from the polished brass and starched white uniforms of the battleships at Pearl Harbor. They operated from forward bases cut out of the jungle, places like Tulagi and Rendova, where the heat was absolute and the air hung thick with the smell of rotting vegetation and high-octane gasoline. These sailors were a breed apart. They wore cut-off shorts, grew beards, and traded supplies with the Marines. They were technically Navy, but their war was intimate and guerrilla. Their boats, built by the Elko and Higgins boatworks, were marvels of speed, but terrified of heavy weather. A PT boat was essentially an 80-foot racing shell made of mahogany plywood, packed with 3 massive Packard V12 engines delivering 4,500 horsepower. They were fast, loud, and incredibly flammable. By late 1942, the frustration among these crews was palpable. They were being sent out nightly into the terrifying maze of the Solomon Islands to intercept barges they couldn't sink. They began to view their primary weapon, the torpedo, as dead weight. A loaded torpedo tube weighed thousands of pounds, slowing the boat down and making it sluggish in a turn. Worse, the tubes were vulnerable. A stray bullet from a Japanese barge could detonate the compressed air tanks or the warhead, vaporizing the crew instantly. The crews began to scrounge. In the military vernacular of the South Pacific, scrounging was the art of acquiring unauthorized equipment to stay alive. They stole armor plate from wrecked ships to bolt onto their cockpits. They welded Army anti-tank guns to their foredecks. But they needed something automatic. Something with a punch that could shatter a diesel engine block or tear open a sandbagged hull in seconds. A few miles away, at the jungle airstrips of Henderson Field and elsewhere, the United States Army Air Forces faced a different problem. They were flying the Bell P-39 Airacobra. On paper, the P-39 was a sleek, modern fighter. In the air against the Japanese Zero, it was often a death trap. It lacked a high-altitude supercharger, meaning it performed poorly above 15,000 feet, where the air war was often fought. However, the P-39 had been built around a singular, massive design feature. The Oldsmobile T9, later designated M4, 37mm autocannon. This weapon was a beast. It fired a high-explosive shell, weighing nearly 1.5 pounds. Unlike a machine gun, which relied on kinetic energy to punch holes, the 37mm shell carried a bursting charge. It didn't just pierce, it detonated. In the nose of a P-39, the gun fired through the propeller hub, fed by a 30-round circular magazine that sat between the pilot's knees. While the P-39 struggled in dogfights, the M4 cannon was devastating against ground targets. As P-39s were shot down, crashed on landing, or simply grounded due to mechanical failures, they began to pile up in the boneyards of the island airfields. The planes were scrap, but their nose cannons were intact. It didn't take long for the enterprising engineers of the PT bases, the motormac machinists who could fix anything with a wrench and a curse, to look at the P-39's nose gun and then look at the empty foredeck of a PT boat. The logic was undeniable. The M4 cannon was relatively light for its caliber. It was air-cooled, and it was automatic. If they could rip the gun out of the plane and mount it on a boat, they wouldn't just have a machine gun. They would have rapid-fire artillery. The convergence of the Navy's desperate need for firepower and the Army's surplus of failed fighters was about to change the nature of the night war. The PT boat was about to stop trying to be a destroyer and start becoming a gunship. The transformation of the PT fleet began not in a factory, but in the mud of forward repair bases like Tulagi. Here, the motormacs, Navy machinists, and hull repair specialists performed surgery on the machines of war. The process of transplanting a P-39's nose cannon onto a boat was an act of industrial improvisation. The M4 autocannon was never designed for a pintle mount. In the Airacobra, it was rigidly fixed to the airframe, the recoil absorbed by the entire mass of the aircraft. On a PT boat, there was no such structure. The engineers had to invent one. They scavenged steel pipes and plating from damaged landing craft. They cut, welded, and bolted together crude tripods and pedestals, bolting them directly through the mahogany foredeck into the boat's structural ribs. It was ugly, Frankenstein engineering. The guns often looked raw, stripping away the sleek aerodynamic fairings of the aircraft to reveal the brutal machinery underneath, the heavy recoil spring, the blocky receiver, and the long, menacing black barrel. For the gunner, the weapon was a physical beast. The M4 fed from a 30-round horseshoe-shaped magazine that sat heavily on top of the receiver. In a cramped fighter cockpit, this magazine was tucked away. On the open deck of a heaving boat, it was a constant burden. A loader had to stand exposed next to the gunner, wrestling these heavy steel crescents of ammunition into place while the boat slammed over waves. When the trigger was pulled, the experience was visceral. The M4 did not fire with the high-pitched burst of a machine gun. It fired with a slow, heavy, rhythmic cadence, about 140 rounds per minute. Thump, thump, thump. Each shot sent a shockwave through the plywood deck. The recoil was violent, rocking the bow of the 80-foot boat. The muzzle flash was blinding in the dark, destroying the gunner's night vision instantly. But the effect on the target was undeniable. The standard ammunition for the M4 was the high explosive shell. Unlike the solid armor-piercing slugs used by anti-tank guns, these shells were filled with tetryl explosive. They were designed to tear apart aluminum aircraft skin, which meant that against the wooden hulls of Japanese barges, they were devastating. A single hit would blow a hole the size of a dinner plate. A 3-round burst could shatter the keel, or detonate the fuel drums stored on deck. However, the weapon was temperamental. It was prone to jamming if the belt feed wasn't perfectly aligned, or if saltwater corrosion fouled the mechanism. The gunners had to become experts in percussive maintenance, often clearing jams with a mallet in the middle of a firefight. They learned to fire in short, controlled bursts, 3 or 4 rounds, to keep the barrel from overheating, and to conserve the limited ammunition supply. This modification fundamentally changed the psychology of the crew. With torpedoes, they were snipers, trying to take a single perfect shot from a distance. With the 37mm cannon, they became brawlers. They wanted to get close. They stopped fearing the barges and started hunting them. The Devil boat crews began to strip off the torpedo tubes entirely to save weight, replacing them with more guns, more ammo, and even depth charges to drop in the path of pursuing destroyers. The PT boat was no longer a torpedo boat. It was a shallow water gunship, a predator evolved specifically for the unique ecosystem of the Solomon Islands. To the Japanese soldiers crowded onto the decks of the Daihatsu barges, the night had eyes. They called the American PT boats the Green Dragons, or Devil boats. For months, the barge crews had operated with a measure of impunity, relying on the shallow draft of the reefs to protect them from American destroyers and the erratic performance of torpedoes to save them from the PTs. But when the 37mm cannons arrived, the equation of survival changed instantly. The sound of the P-39 cannon was distinct and terrifying. Unlike the continuous buzz of a machine gun, the slow thump, thump, thump of the autocannon was a death knell. It meant the Americans were close, horrifically close. The tactical evolution of the PT squadrons was rapid and ruthless. The American skippers realized that speed, their greatest asset in open water, was a liability in the barge hunt. A PT boat at full throttle kicked up a massive white wake, a phosphorescent arrow pointing directly to their location in the moonlit waters. The roar of the 3 Packard engines could be heard for miles. So, they learned to stalk. The new doctrine was silence. Crews would patrol at idling speed, their exhaust ports buried under water to muffle the rumble. In the darkest stretches of the Blackett Strait, they would cut the engines entirely, drifting with the tide, listening. The radar operators, hunched over the glowing green screens of their primitive SO radar sets, became the hunters' eyes. They looked for the small fuzzy blips that signaled a barge train moving against the coastline. When a target was acquired, the violence was initiated at point-blank range, often less than 100 yards. The Devil boats would drift out of the gloom, engines suddenly roaring to life as they crossed the T of the Japanese column. The 37mm was the opener. The gunner would target the engine compartment of the lead barge. A single 37mm high-explosive shell hitting a diesel engine block did not just stop the boat. It often disintegrated the stern. Once the lead barge was burning, illuminating the rest of the convoy, the PT boat would unleash everything else. Twin .50 caliber machine guns soaring through the wooden hulls, and 20mm Oerlikons sweeping the decks. For the Japanese garrisons on islands like Kolombangara and Bougainville, the impact was not just tactical. It was existential. These barges were their lifeline. They carried rice, quinine, and ammunition. As the Barge Busters became more proficient, the supplies stopped arriving. Soldiers on the isolated islands began to starve. Diaries recovered from Japanese bodies later in the campaign spoke of the hunger that eats the mind and the terror of the night sea, where the American boats waited like sharks. The PT crews had successfully turned the tables. They were no longer the hunted mosquitoes swatting ineffectually at giants. They had become the apex predators of the shallow water. And on the night of August 1st, 1943, in the churning waters of the Blackett Strait, that predatory instinct would be tested in one of the most chaotic engagements of the war. October 2nd, 1943. 2300 hours. The Blackett Strait. The heat is a physical weight, pressing down on the 3 PT boats drifting in the center of the channel. The water is glass calm, reflecting the tapestry of stars above. But the crews of PT-163, PT-169, and PT-171 are not looking up. They are looking at the coastline of Kolombangara, a jagged black silhouette against the night sky. On the bridge of the lead boat, the skipper holds the microphone of the TBS radio, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. The engines are declutched, idling with a low, gargling rumble that barely carries over the water. The crews speak in whispers. The gunners check their feeds for the 100th time. The loader on the bow of PT-163 runs his hand over the cold steel of the 37mm shell casing, ensuring the heavy magazine is seated correctly in the breech of the scavenged P-39 cannon. Inside the stifling chart house, the radarman stares into the rubber hood of the SO radar scope. The green sweep line rotates rhythmically. Whoosh, whoosh. The screen is filled with the static clutter of the nearby islands. Land return that makes spotting small boats a nightmare. But then he sees it. A cluster of faint, rhythmic pulses moving slowly against the static of the shore. Skipper, the radar man's voice is tight. Contacts, range 2,000 yards, bearing 180, moving slow. The skipper raises his binoculars. At 2,000 yards, the night is a wall of grey and black. He sees nothing, but the radar doesn't lie. It is an ant convoy. Likely 4 or 5 armored Daihatsu barges, heavily laden with troops and supplies, creeping along the reef line to avoid detection. The order goes out over the TBS. All units stand by to engage. Attack Plan Baker. The idle rumble of the packets deepens into a growl as the clutches engage. The boats do not surge forward yet. They creep. The strategy is simple but deadly. They will cut the corner, drifting into the path of the barges to silhouette them against the open sea, denying them the sanctuary of the shoreline. 1,500 yards. The gunners on the bow tense up. The 37mm cannon is unguided, crude, and manual. There are no sights illuminated by electricity here. The gunner looks over the open iron sights, judging the lead, feeling the roll of the ocean. 1,000 yards. A spark of light on the water. Someone on a barge has lit a cigarette, or perhaps opened a furnace door. It is the confirmation they needed. The silhouette of the lead barge hardens in the gloom, blocky, low, and ugly. 800 yards. The Japanese crews still haven't seen them. The wind is blowing from the shore, carrying the sound of the PT engines away to sea. The Americans have achieved the perfect ambush. Open fire. The silence of the Solomons is about to be ripped apart. The night splits open with a flash of orange light. The lead PT boat's 37mm cannon kicks back on its mount, the recoil shuddering through the wooden deck plates. Thump, thump, thump. The traces from the heavy autocannon are distinct, slow, fat bolts of fire that arc lazily through the air before slamming into the lead barge. The impact is instantaneous and horrific. The first shell hits the waterline, blowing a jagged hole in the timber hull. The second hits the cargo hold. The high explosive warhead detonates inside the packed assembly of fuel drums and ammunition crates. The lead barge doesn't just sink, it disintegrates. A column of fire erupts 50 feet into the air, turning the pitch-black strait into a harsh, flickering daylight. Hard to port. Keep moving. The skipper screams over the roar of the engines. The element of surprise is gone. The remaining Japanese barges break formation, their crews scrambling to uncover their own weapons. Heavy machine gun fire erupts from the enemy vessels, green tracers seeking out the mahogany hulls of the Americans. Water geysers erupt around the PT boats as bullets slap the sea. This is the brawl the crews were built for. The PTs accelerate, their bows rising out of the water, engines screaming at 2,000 RPM. They don't run away, they run through. On the foredeck, the gunner fights the motion of the boat, wrestling the heavy M4 cannon to the right. The smoke from the muzzle blast stings his eyes, but the burning wreck of the first barge illuminates the second target. It's an armored Daihatsu, sandbags lining its gunnels, 25mm cannon fire sparking from its deck. The gunner depresses the spade grips. Thump, thump. The first shot goes wide, skipping off a wave. The second strikes the barge's armored ramp. The third finds the mark, the exposed engine compartment at the stern. The shell punches through the thin steel plating and detonates the diesel block. The barge shudders violently, loses way, and begins to list. It is a chaotic, swirling melee. The air is thick with the smell of cordite and burning gasoline. The .50 caliber machine guns in the PT turrets are hammering away, soaring through the wooden superstructures of the surviving barges. Tracers crisscross in a deadly web. Then, as quickly as it began, the resistance collapses. The surviving barges, their engines dead, or their pilots killed, drift aimlessly toward the reef. The water is littered with debris and burning oil. Cease fire. Cease fire. The order filters down. The heavy thumping of the 37mm stops. The sudden silence is deafening, broken only by the crackle of burning wood and the frantic shouting of Japanese survivors in the water. The PT boats throttle back, their engines returning to a low rumble. They circle the carnage once, verifying the kills, before turning their bows toward the open sea. The mission is done. The ants have been crushed. As the sun rose over the Blackett Strait, the following morning, the violence of the night was replaced by a grim, silent testament to the efficacy of the devil boats. The water, usually a pristine turquoise, was streaked with black oil and cluttered with the detritus of the destroyed convoy. American reconnaissance flights passing overhead reported the scene. Shattered timber hulls drifting on the tide, hundreds of floating rice bags, and the broken bodies of Imperial Japanese troops. The efficiency of the 37mm cannon was brutally apparent. Unlike torpedo attacks, which often left uncertain results, the carnage of a gunboat ambush was total. The barges hadn't just been damaged, they had been pulverized. For the Japanese garrison commander on Kolombangara, the morning report was a catastrophe. The convoy had been carrying critical supplies: quinine for malaria, ammunition for the howitzers, and tons of rice for starving troops. None of it arrived. Intelligence intercepted from Japanese radio traffic painted a picture of despair. No transport arrived last night. One message read, "Troops are eating roots and lizards. Morale is breaking." The ant transport, the last lifeline for the isolated garrisons, was being severed one barge at a time. Back at the PT base at Lombardy, the mood was one of exhausted vindication. The crews climbed off their boats, their faces blackened by soot and grease, their ears ringing from the concussive force of the autocannons. But as they inspected their weapons, the evidence of their success was clear. The paint on the barrels of the 37mm guns was blistered and peeling from the heat of rapid fire. The decks were buried in spent brass casings. There was no celebration, only the heavy realization of a new reality. They had proven that the PT boat was not a failure. It had simply been miscast. It wasn't a giant killer meant to duel battleships. It was a blockade runner's worst nightmare. The scroungers who had bolted aircraft guns to plywood decks had done more than just modify a boat. They had saved the squadron. However, the cost of this new warfare was becoming clear. Barge busting was close quarters combat. Several PT boats returned with bullet holes raking their hulls, the plywood splintered by Japanese return fire. Crews were wounded by shrapnel and wood splinters. The Barge Busters were winning, but they were fighting a knife fight in a phone booth, and the enemy was learning to fight back. The success of the field modifications in the Solomons sent shockwaves through the naval establishment. The reports filtering back to the Bureau of Ships in Washington, D.C. could no longer be ignored. The commanders on the ground had proven that the era of the torpedo boat in the Pacific was effectively over. The era of the gunboat had begun. This realization led to a sweeping shift in production and doctrine. The Navy stopped viewing the PT boat solely as a delivery system for torpedoes and began reimagining it as a floating battery of automatic weapons. Future iterations of the PT class rolled out of the Elko and Higgins factories with heavier reinforced decks, designed specifically to carry the weight of massive ordnance. The ultimate validation of the Barge Busters came in the form of official refits. One of the most famous examples was PT-59, commanded by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, after the loss of PT-109. Recognizing the lessons learned in the Blackett Strait, the Navy stripped PT-59 of its torpedo tubes entirely. In their place, they mounted two massive 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns and an array of .50 caliber machine guns. The scrounger mentality of the Solomons had become official naval policy. The 37mm M4 autocannon, once a piece of aviation scrap, became a standard prize refit for boats across the theater until heavier weapons became available. Strategically, the impact of the Devil boats was profound. Their nightly dominance of the shallow waters contributed directly to the isolation of Rabaul, the great Japanese fortress in the South Pacific. By cutting the ant transport lines, the PT boats helped enforce the Allied strategy of island hopping. The Americans did not need to invade every Japanese-held island. They simply needed to cut them off and let them wither. The garrisons on Kolombangara and Vella La Vella were not defeated by a massive amphibious assault. They were neutralized by starvation and lack of ammunition. They were strangled by a blockade enforced by wooden boats and scavenged airplane guns. The Mosquito Fleet had successfully closed the net. War is often remembered through the lens of grand strategy and industrial might. The movements of fleets, sea, the output of factories, and the decisions of admirals. But the story of the Barge Busters reveals a different, grittier truth. That the difference between victory and defeat often lies in the hands of 20-year-old machinists working in the mud with a welding torch. The adoption of the 37mm P-39 Autocannon by the PT squadrons of the South Pacific stands as a testament to the raw adaptability of the American fighting man. It was an innovation born not of brilliance, but of desperation. The Navy had provided these men with a doctrine that didn't work and weapons that couldn't hit their targets. Facing a cunning enemy who had rewritten the rules of engagement, the sailors of the Mosquito Fleet didn't wait for permission or new orders. They simply walked into the jungle, found what they needed in a scrap heap, and built a solution. There is a profound irony in the legacy of the P-39 Airacobra. In the skies, it was largely considered a disappointment, an aircraft that failed to live up to its promise. Yet, bolted to the heaving deck of a plywood boat in the pitch-black waters of the Solomons, its failed nose gun became one of the most effective weapons of the naval war. It serves as a reminder that in the chaos of combat, value is not determined by design specifications, but by utility. Today, the PT boats are gone, burned on the beaches at the end of the war, or rotted away in forgotten harbors. The roar of the Packards and the heavy thump of the 37mm cannon have faded into history, but their legacy remains. It is the legacy of the Devil boats, fragile, wooden vessels that dared to hunt in the dark, armed with nothing but courage, gasoline, and the scavenged nose of a fighter plane.